He was born in the Prophet's house, raised among saints and warriors, and died with the Kaaba behind him and 1,000 arrows above. This is not just the story of a man, but of a broken empire, a sacred rebellion, and Mecca's final stand. There are men who are remembered for what they built, others for what they destroyed. But then, there are those few remembered not for what they did, but who they were, even before they held a sword. Abdullah ibn Zubair was one of those few. His story begins not on a battlefield, nor from the throne of a ruler. It begins in the quiet resistance of a woman in hiding. In the dry desert heat, in the shadows of stolen nights, a woman named Asma bint Abu Bakr prepared to give birth. Her father had vanished. Her home was being watched. Her people were hunted. And Islam, at that time, was not powerful, it was endangered. The Prophet had just migrated from Mecca to Medina during one of the most dangerous chapters in the early Muslim community. Life itself hinged on secrecy and survival. Quraysh chased down believers. Betrayals were frequent. Foundations were fragile. And in this moment of tension, life found a way. In that storm of uncertainty, Abdullah ibn Zubair was born. He would be the first child born to the Muslims after the Hijrah, the migration to Medina. And to understand why this matters, you must understand the fear. The Quraysh, desperate to destroy the morale of the Muslims, had spread a lie that the Muslims had been cursed, that they would never bear children in Yathrib, that leaving behind their homeland for faith would mean the end of their bloodlines. But this child, Abdullah, was proof that the future of Islam was alive. His newborn cry was more than relief. It was a declaration. And when the people of Medina heard of it, they celebrated him like a prophecy fulfilled. What made this birth more powerful was his lineage. His bloodline was not ordinary. His mother, Asma, was the daughter of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the Prophet's closest companion and the first man to believe in Islam after Khadija. Abu Bakr had accompanied the Prophet into the cave during the migration, risking everything for his noble friend. His father, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, one of the Ashara Mubasharun, the 10 companions promised paradise by the Prophet. Zubair was a warrior, a man who had wielded his sword in defense of the Prophet when others hesitated, a cousin of the Prophet, companion at Badr, and a mountain of loyalty. Through his father's side, Abdullah was connected to some of the most heroic figures in Islam. Through his mother, he was woven tightly into the Prophet's household. That made him a nephew of Aisha R.A., the mother of the believers and one of the most knowledgeable and respected individuals in Islamic history. He was not raised close to Rasulullah. He was raised inside his orbit. Asma, while pregnant, had traveled from Mecca to Medina on foot, carrying him under her heart. She endured threats, hunger, and attack, all while protecting what she knew her son would become. Her perseverance became legend, earning her the title Dat an-Nitaqain, the woman of the 2 waistbands, because she tore her own waistband to carry supplies to the Prophet and her father hiding in the cave of Thawr. That is the womb from which he came. That is the house he was born into. That is the legacy he would one day die defending. But Abdullah didn't just inherit names, he inherited standards. He grew up during the golden years of the Islamic State, during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. These weren't distant rulers to him. They were father figures, mentors, family, He watched the Ummah reach its peak of faith, justice, expansion, and unity. He witnessed a generation define leadership not by power, but by character. He recited Quran before he rode a horse. He listened to hadith with the same intensity that others learned military commands. And as he aged, he didn't just watch the battles of Islam, he joined them. He participated in early campaigns as a young man, showing rare courage and unshakable discipline. But even when trusted with power, he remained grounded. Unlike many of the noblemen of Quraysh, Abdullah ibn Zubair had no appetite for luxury. He wore dignity like others wore armor. He feared sin more than he feared death. People described him as handsome, strong, but quiet, reserved. He didn't speak to flatter, and when he did speak, it burned like a torch in a court of fog. Truth sat on his tongue as naturally as muscle sat on his frame. And yet, underneath his composed exterior, he had the fire of a man who had tasted purity and wasn't going to stand and watch it fall. His family did not teach him to obey power. They taught him to question it. And though he loved Mecca, loved Medina, loved his people, he would never swear allegiance to a tyrant, not for gold, not for peace, not even for his life. This made him dangerous, because in a world where corruption was beginning to replace righteousness behind the veils of power, a man like Abdullah couldn't be bought. He couldn't be manipulated, and he certainly couldn't be ignored. He was born in the shadows of Hijrah, but he would die in the burning light of resistance, because his bloodline was stained not with politics, but with prophecy. As Abdullah ibn Zubair came of age, his presence became impossible to ignore. He wasn't just built for spiritual legacy, he was born with battlefield resolve. From the early days, companions around him could see a rare combination: the sharpness of intellect paired with physical discipline. His body was defined, his arrow never missed, and his sword, when drawn, was wielded with the intention of justice, not oppression. Though still young, Abdullah had already fought in several campaigns and wasn't just filling space. He stood out among legends. He once accompanied the Muslim armies into Africa, displaying uncommon bravery on foreign soil. His archery skills were unmatched, and his commitment to truth carried a weight few could rival. But unlike many warriors, his strength wasn't drawn from his ego or the love of battle. It was born from a commitment to what was right, no matter the cost. In Medina, he would frequent the sacred mosque, pray beside scholars, study under the likes of Ibn Abbas, observe fiqh, and memorize hadith. In one moment, he was a fighter. In another, a fasting worshipper. In the next, a student of jurisprudence. While others sought titles, Abdullah remained silent. While other men of noble blood chased comfort or political power, Abdullah walked with his head down and heart armored. The son of Zubair, the grandson of Abu Bakr, the nephew of Aisha, all these connections gave him access to the heart of power. But instead of using that access to elevate himself, he hid behind humility. This is what set him apart. He didn't seek power. He didn't crave governance. Power chased him. The people trusted him. The scholars respected him. The soldiers followed him. There were moments when the fragile stability of the Islamic world depended on men like Abdullah, men who could not be bribed, pressured, or seduced by empire. And yet, his destiny wasn't to live in a golden palace or lead massive public campaigns. His test would rise not when the Ummah was united, but when it was fractured. When truth and falsehood wore the same clothes. When caliphs were crowned without shura. When family turned on family. When blood poured in the house of prophecy. When the Umayyad dynasty would turn the Khilafah into monarchy, violating the very principles it was founded on. And in that storm, many would fold. It's easier to survive seated beneath the throne than standing alone before it. But Abdullah wasn't made for shadows. The turning point came after the death of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and the rise of his son Yazid as ruler. Unlike his father, who had earned his power and maintained outward peace, Yazid entered leadership through inheritance. Not Islamic consensus, not shura, not piety. For many, it was a political shift. For Abdullah, it was a betrayal. The Ummah, that had once followed the righteous caliphs, was now asked to bow to a dynasty, a man of wine and politics, seated on a throne carved not by merit, but legacy. When Yazid demanded allegiance, most complied, some out of fear, some out of confusion, and some, tragically, out of comfort. But a few refused. A few men still remembered what the Khilafah was supposed to be. A few men could not sleep beneath oppression. Among them was Abdulrahman ibn Abi Bakr, Hussein ibn Ali, and Abdullah ibn Zubair. When Medina received notice of Yazid's rule, people looked toward Abdullah. What would he do? Would he keep the peace or resist? His answer was unwavering. He left the city, heading to Mecca, not in retreat, but in principle. There, under the shadow of the Kaaba, he positioned himself where no worldly rule could reach, directly beside the house of Allah. In doing so, he both protected himself and drew a line in the sand. Yazid ruled in palaces. Abdullah stood in the harem. He refused to give bay'ah. And soon, he became the symbolic guardian of real Islamic leadership. Though he never claimed the title of caliph, the people began to proclaim him as such. In Mecca, in Medina, in Yemen, even in parts of Iraq and Egypt, allegiances swayed in his favor. But this wasn't just the story of rebellion, it was the story of trust. The people didn't follow Abdullah because he was hungry for power. They followed him because he had spent his entire life showing he wouldn't compromise. Not when it came to truth, not when it came to purity. Leaders come and go, generals rise and collapse. But when the people see someone who carries sacred legacy, personal discipline, and fear of God, they follow. And that's what began to happen. Abdullah ibn Zubair slowly became more than a man. He became a symbol, a revival, a whisper of the Rashidun era reborn. He governed Mecca with humility, refused to enrich himself, devoted his nights to prayer and his days to strategy. Visitors would find him fasting, reciting Quran, never reclining. His rule was free of pomp and politics, but it could not last, because Mecca, as protected as it seemed, was not outside the reach of empires. Yazid would not tolerate the defiance. Caliphate or not, the Umayyad dynasty had declared its sovereignty, and Abdullah ibn Zubair, the pure, one in the haram, had become the greatest threat to that legacy. The winds of war had already started to rise, and soon the Kaaba would not remain untouched. Arrows would fly, fire would fall, the house of God would become a battlefield, and in the center of it, standing calmly, sword in one hand, Quran in the other, would be the man born in Hijrah, raised in honor, forged in faith. Because destiny does not knock on the doors of kings. It finds men like Abdullah, guides them into fire, and caused them to die, not on golden thrones, but in sacred dust. And by now, everyone knew the last breath of that prophetic generation would be drawn in Mecca. He was the son of a warrior, forged not just by blood, but by battle cries, by dust-covered fields, and by the sound of unsheathed steel in the service of faith. Abdullah ibn Zubair was not raised on lullabies or soft-spoken luxury. He was raised in the shadow of one of the most legendary swordsmen in Islamic history. His father, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, a man whose very name struck fear into enemy ranks and inspired awe among believers. Zubair wasn't just a fighter, he was one of the Prophet's earliest companions, a cousin, a brother-in-law, a soldier at Badr, and among those 10 companions, al-Ashara al-Mubasharun, promised Jannah while they were still alive. This was the man from whom Abdullah drew his fire. From his earliest moments, it was clear. This would not be a child molded by fear. This would be a warrior raised in faith. The atmosphere of Abdullah's childhood was unlike that of the typical Qurayshi noble. His household was a forge of resilience. His father would not return home with trade goods or tribal gossip. He returned with war wounds, memories of campaigns beside the Prophet, and stories soaked in meaning. He didn't teach his son to sit still, to bow quietly, or to count coins. Zubair ibn al-Awwam taught his son how to ride before he could read, how to shoot an arrow before he could recite poetry. But he also taught him something deeper, to fear nothing but Allah. This became the axis around which Abdullah's character revolved. Even in his childhood, companions took note of Abdullah's fortitude. He didn't whimper during hardship. He didn't complain of pain. He embraced physical exertion with pride, as if training was not a chore, but his responsibility. And it wasn't for vanity, it was preparation. His body became defined, his reflexes sharp, his gaze steadied by the weight of purpose. But what truly made him different was not just his physical power. It was his refusal to compromise his dignity. From the moment his values began to take shape, he developed a stubbornness that could not be softened. He did not flatter rulers, did not tolerate injustice, and above all, did not pretend to accept what he found morally false. That wasn't arrogance, it was inheritance. His father had lived the same way. Zubair had opposed tyranny even when it cost him alliances. His loyalty was to the truth, not to the politics of men. So it's no wonder that Abdullah, raised in such fire, walked the same path. History doesn't record a moment when Abdullah decided to become a warrior. Why? Because it was never a decision. It was who he was. As a teenager, he began accompanying military expeditions. By the time he entered his 20s, he was already an accomplished fighter, trusted enough to be sent on major campaigns, including the famous Siege of North Africa. There, his leadership began to shine through. Even among older, more experienced men, Abdullah commanded respect, not by demanding it, but by embodying it. He fought in formation, not in ego. He didn't chase individual glory, but he was often the one to turn the tides of battle by sheer will and bravery. His fighting wasn't mindless violence, it was mission-aligned. Scholars, generals, and companions all commented on how he mixed valor with principle, as if his blade only moved when truth was dragged into danger. His presence on the field was known, his horse the first into the breach, and his voice often the one calling others to bravery. But even in times of glory, he remained remarkably grounded. He didn't celebrate flashy victories. He didn't glorify his record. In fact, after battles, those who fought alongside him recall how he would pray as if seeking forgiveness for having raised the sword. That was the irony of his strength. He was born to fight, but prayed for peace. And yet, as years passed, that peace became harder to make sense of. A growing discomfort settled in him, not about his role as a warrior, but about the direction the Ummah seemed to be taking. Under the rule of Uthman, unrest began to stir in the hearts of the people. Whispers of nepotism, of dissatisfied governors, of unresolved grievances. And while Abdullah respected the Caliph and loved righteousness, he couldn't ignore the cracks forming in the structure he had pledged to protect. To him, justice was not negotiable, no matter who sat on the throne. His heart resisted factionalism, but his soul could not remain neutral. He was a man born into integrity, and that integrity was beginning to starve in the world around him. When blood was spilled among Muslims, Abdullah grieved deeply. When things fell apart after Uthman's death, when the sword was lifted between Ali and Muawiyah, Abdullah bore witness, not as a blind partisan, but as a reluctant observer of political disintegration. His worldview, however, remained simple. When someone ruled with justice, they were to be respected. When they ruled with tyranny, resistance wasn't rebellion, it was obligation. This became a blueprint etched into his soul. Islam was not built by power, it was defended by principle. By now, his personality had fully hardened. He had the strength of a warrior, the heart of a Zahid, and the mind of a philosopher. He didn't pursue a luxurious life. He slept on humble bedding, ate plainly, and trained with obsessive consistency. By the time Yazid ascended and demanded allegiance, the world would finally witness what that training had been preparing him for. This was no political player standing in opposition. This was a purified model of faith, the living extension of what his father Zubair had swung his sword for. And yet, one must remember, Abdullah ibn Zubair did not seek power. He only refused to bow to it. That refusal would change everything. In the years that followed, Abdullah ibn Zubair's reputation spread far beyond the battlefield. His name was whispered with admiration in the tents of warriors, discussed respectfully in the homes of scholars, and prayed for in the hearts of the righteous. He was the son of Zubair, but by now he was carving his own legend. What made him distinct was not just his courage, but the cause that fueled it. While other men grew tired and compromised with age, Abdullah only grew firmer in his principles. His defiance of falsehood did not soften, his longing for truth did not dull, and his hatred for oppression, whether from friend or foe, remained, fixed like the stars that watched over Mecca's skies. People began to notice that Abdullah didn't compete for recognition, yet his presence couldn't be missed. He didn't seek leadership, but his discipline demanded respect. In speech, he was calm but powerful. In action, he was decisive. There was a silence around him that did not feel empty. It felt strong. When he walked into a room, people didn't wait for him to speak out of fear. They waited because they knew that when he did, every word would be backed by weight. He wasn't loud, but he wasn't afraid either. Even as corrupt governors rose across the growing Islamic empire, men who bent the rule of law like it was twine, Abdullah didn't flinch. He openly criticized their decadence. When others silenced themselves to stay close to power, Abdullah stepped back. He didn't want anything to do with it. If he was ever close to the ruling class, it was only to say what nobody else dared say. But he wasn't suicidal, nor was he reckless. He was prepared. Every insult he hurled at injustice was matched by the strength in his limbs and the fire in his heart. He knew that if you ever chose to stand against tyranny, you'd better be willing to fight. And so, his faith in his father's warrior blood made him one of the most dangerous men alive, not because he was harming others, but because he couldn't be controlled. And in every empire, the thing most feared is the one that refuses to kneel. As the Umayyad dynasty settled more deeply into power, the winds of leadership changed. Lineage replaced legitimacy. Thrones passed down families like inheritance, bypassing shura and qualifications. Systemic injustice began leaking into the public consciousness. Governors ruled cities as private kingdoms. Gold flowed toward the political elite, while whispers of discontent stirred in the streets. And then came the greatest offense to everything men like Abdullah stood for: Yazid ibn Muawiyah. The son of the former Caliph Muawiyah, Yazid's rise to power was not through consultation or merit. It was orchestrated, declared, and enforced, all while bypassing the basic principles the Prophet had established. Yazid was known for his extravagance, love of comfort, and most heartbreakingly, disrespect for sacred limits. Stories of his debauchery circulated in quiet corners. Wine, women, stubborn pride, and distance from the Quran and Sunnah. For some, these were only rumors. For others, exaggerations. But for men like Abdullah ibn Zubair, and certainly for Hussein ibn Ali, it was unacceptable. When Yazid demanded bay'ah allegiance, the Ummah found itself at a crossroads. Many complied for the sake of unity. Others were threatened or bribed into silence. But a few, only a few, refused. Among them stood two names that would shape history: Hussein ibn Ali and Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Abdullah's refusal wasn't part of a master plan to lead the world. He did not gather armies. He did not stand on pulpits and announce his own Khilafah. His resistance was silent, but firm. He simply refused to associate what was once the greatest spiritual office in the world, the Khilafah, with the reign of Yazid. And for that refusal, he would become hunted. He fled to Mecca, but not to hide. Mecca was a sanctuary, the Haram, the safest place on earth. For a time, Yazid dared not send an army there. And so, in the sacred city, Abdullah began to live a life of simple resistance. He stayed among the people, taught in the mosque, governed with humility. His meals were modest, his nights filled with worship. He was not building a state with castles, but with trust. His leadership was spiritual before it was political. But the people started to notice, and soon oaths of allegiance began to arrive from the Hejaz, from Iraq, from parts of Egypt and Yemen. All across the fractured Islamic empire, people who wanted justice returned to found it in Abdullah. His courage to speak made him their voice. His refusal to pledge allegiance to Yazid made him their caliph. Whether he accepted the title or not, the masses had decided. And so, the son of the sword, born in the house of Asma, trained by Zubair, mentored by the lives of the rightly guided caliphs, would find himself the new target of an aging empire. Mecca glowed with his leadership. But soon the empire would respond with fire. the man who never chased power, now stood upon its shoulders. And every man with a crown would soon turn their eyes toward the city of Ibrahim, where one man stood, beneath the Kaaba, unwilling to kneel. Because Abdullah ibn Zubair was not created to sit beside kings. He was created to stand alone with truth and let the world move around him. Uthman ibn Affan, the third Caliph of Islam, was not a warrior like Umar, nor a newly freed slave rising to greatness, but a noble merchant with a heart soaked in gentleness. He was generous, dignified, and deeply beloved by the Prophet. Yet in the quiet echo of his kindness, a storm was brewing. As the Islamic Empire expanded beyond the imagination of the earliest Muslims, from Persia to North Africa, from Yemen to the gates of Constantinople, the pressure on leadership grew heavier. Tribes felt disconnected from the center. Governors abused power. Wealth flowed into the hands of a few, and dissatisfaction spread like fire under a gilded rug. Uthman, in his sincerity, stood in the middle, upholding the unity of the Ummah, but caught between reform and loyalty to old comrades. And as the voices of rebellion grew louder, Abdullah ibn Zubair was not a child anymore. He was a witness to the unraveling of a golden era. He saw the companions age. He saw letters sent, warnings ignored, mistakes made, and enemies given shelter under veils of trust. And then, finally, it happened. Uthman, the man who once hosted revelation in his hands, was slaughtered in his own home, holding the Quran as blood fell across its pages. The world shifted. Something sacred had been broken. Abdullah ibn Zubair, still young but increasingly influential, was not at the center of the killing, but he was close enough to feel its heat. The chaos that followed wasn't just political, it was deeply spiritual. The companions were no longer unified. What once was the clearest leadership in human history had turned murky. The Khilafah shifted to Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, a man distinguished by intellect, piety, and unwavering courage. Yet even his name did not rescue the crumbling unity. Civil war broke between him and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria and relative of the slain. Uthman, who demanded justice before allegiance. Battle lines were drawn not between believers and disbelievers, but between believers and believers. Swords now divided former comrades. Lines of Quran memorizing warriors stood across from each other as companions on both sides wept, not because they doubted themselves, but because they knew what had been lost. Abdullah ibn Zubair stood firmly by his father, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, who initially aligned with those who sought arbitration against Ali's leadership. But during one pivotal moment before the infamous Battle of the Camel, Ali reminded Zubair of a hadith spoken by the Prophet, that Zubair would one day be in the wrong and learn of it before a tragic end. The words struck deep. Zubair, noble, still withdrew, refused to raise his sword against Ali. But on his way back, his journey came to an end. He was murdered in cold blood while in prayer. The assassination of Zubair ibn al-Awwam wasn't just a personal loss for Abdullah, it was a symbolic nail in unity's coffin. A companion of the Prophet had been killed not by the Quraysh or the disbelievers, but by a Muslim of his own time during the earliest civil war in Islam. Abdullah's grief was deep, but it hardened something within him too, a refusal to fall into faction for its own sake. He did not become a blind supporter of Ali, nor of Muawiyah, nor did he seek political advantage. He chose instead to retreat toward Mecca, preserve himself, and wait for clarity, not chaos. In the years that followed, Islam would turn into something few could have predicted. Ali's leadership, under siege from all sides, continued until his martyrdom. His son Hassan briefly ruled, then stepped down for the sake of temporary unity. That unity would not last. Slowly, over time, the political arm of the Umayyad state sharpened into an empire, not a caliphate rooted in consultation, but a dynasty led by appointment and inheritance. The Qurayshi elites regained control, but their governance no longer carried the whisper of prophetic ethics. And while the cities were quiet, the hearts of the faithful were uneasy. Compromise had brought temporary peace, but stripped the Ummah of its moral compass. Then Karbala happened. It wasn't the battle that wounded the Ummah. It was the shame. In the dry dust of Karbala's earth, the beloved grandson of the Prophet, Hussein ibn Ali, was cornered by Yazid's forces. Refusing to pledge allegiance to a man he viewed as corrupt and unfit, Hussein stood not for rebellion, but for righteousness. He was offered deals, power, safe passage. But he refused, and like his father, he was killed not by outsiders, but by men who claimed to serve Islam. Alongside Hussein fell his sons, his nephews, his companions, thirsty, surrounded, outnumbered. The Euphrates nearby, yet his children died with parched lips. When the news reached Mecca and Medina, a silence fell over the hearts of those who still remembered the Prophet's embrace of his grandson. That silence soon turned to rage. For many, Yazid's crimes had crossed every limit. Governments can be questioned, but bloodlines of the Prophet were sacred, and Yazid had desecrated that line. Among those most disturbed was Abdullah ibn Zubayr. But unlike others, he didn't explode with slogans or vengeance. He remained silent. He walked among the people of Mecca, unarmed, praying, teaching, fasting. But his silence was not weakness. It was waiting, watching, knowing that time and truth are allies when corruption rushes forward. And sure enough, months later, Yazid's soldiers arrived, not at Karbala this time, but in Mecca itself. They did not come to pray, they came to demand allegiance, and Abdullah refused. He refused quietly, without a banner, without a speech. No armies at his back, no grand claim to Khilafah, no ambition written in his expression, just a firm no. His refusal echoed beyond the walls of the Haram. It reached Medina, Damascus, Iraq, and Egypt. People began to speak his name with reverence, with possibility. Mecca had not bowed. Despite Yazid's grip tightening around every major region of the Islamic Empire, one man, one city, had said no. Abdullah ibn Zubayr became more than a scholar or a warrior or a son of noble blood. He became a symbol, a living reminder that righteousness once ruled from the minbar, not through crowns and gold, and therein lay the danger. Yazid knew killing Hussein had wounded the Ummah's heart, but as long as Abdullah lived, that heart could begin beating again. So Yazid did what empires do when threatened. He sent an army, a large and merciless one under the command of Hussein ibn Numayr, with a single goal: extract allegiance from Abdullah, or destroy Mecca altogether. The very idea that the Kaaba, house of God and Qibla of all believers, could be targeted was once unimaginable. But now it was not only possible, it was happening. The army approached Mecca near the end of Yazid's reign and laid siege to the sacred city. But defending Mecca was not alien to Abdullah. His grandfather Abu Bakr had defended the Prophet in the cave of Thor, hidden in the dark. His father Zubair had stood before armies that outnumbered him many times. Courage ran through his veins like fire in a sword blade. He took to the rooftops and walls with his men. The people of Mecca, inspired by his defiance and trust in Allah, rallied around him. Together, they resisted wave after wave of attack. Accounts describe the unimaginable: stone throwers and catapults, targeting the holiest place in Islam, the Kaaba's structure being damaged by fires and payloads, its covering burned. Smoke darkened the sky where pilgrims once prayed. And in the middle of this horror was Abdullah ibn Zubair, not hiding in a palace, not fleeing the city, but defending every street, every alley, every inch of sacred ground with full trust that the one he worshipped would either grant victory or martyrdom. And then something even more unimaginable happened. News came that Yazid had died. Just like that. The caliph around whom so much fear and blood had been spilled was suddenly gone. The Umayyad army, startled, leaderless, and newly cautious, pulled back. For a moment, the chaos paused. Scattered factions who had bowed to Yazid for convenience or fear now raised their heads. Abdullah ibn Zubair was still standing, and in the absence of a clear heir, the Quran reader of Mecca began to look a lot like the Caliph the Ummah had been missing. Slowly, allegiance began pouring in, not forced by threat or manipulated by wealth, but offered freely by governors, scholars, communities. Medina submitted, Yemen followed, Basra joined. Even parts of Greater Syria acknowledged his leadership. He did not seize these regions with war. They came to him because he had become everything Yazid was not: honest, disciplined, faithful, and just. And still, Abdullah did not rush to claim the title of caliph. He ruled with the authority the people had given him, but never declared it arrogantly. He reinstated justice in the courts. The khutbahs were restored. Islamic coinage was minted in his name. His rule reflected more the model of Umar than any dynastic king. He still wore rough garments, still fasted obsessively, still studied like a student rather than a sovereign. But as more territory joined him, pressure began to grow. Not from the people, but from history itself. Fate was circling him again, and behind that fate, the Umayyads were reassembling. In Damascus, the dynasty was breathing again. Yazid's son, Muawiyah II, briefly held the seat, but exited history quickly and without impact. With the center of power fragile, the Umayyad loyalist camp sought new leadership. They found it in a man of cunning ambition and political maturity, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Unlike Yazid, Abdul Malik was intelligent, strategic, and determined to return Damascus to unmatched authoritarian control. He restored the dynasty's command by working from the inside, replacing wavering governors, consolidating military strength, and, most importantly, declaring his top priority to bring down Abdullah ibn Zubair no matter the cost. And so began a silent countdown to confrontation. The unity around Abdullah, once wide and hopeful, began to stretch thin. Iraq grew restless, its tribal conflicts resurfacing. Kufans, historically unreliable, failed to stand firm. Egypt was destabilized, and slowly, without full-out war, cracks formed under Abdullah's empire. Abdul Malik bided his time carefully, building up resources and waiting for the perfect opportunity. When the time came, he would not simply send an army. He would send a blade with no mercy and no hesitation. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. In Mecca, Abdullah began to feel not only the pressure of external threats, but the loneliness of principle. He had never wavered, but others did. He held on to the teachings of the Prophet, the example of Abu Bakr, the echo of his father's uprightness. But the world no longer moved slowly. Steel and power were replacing piety and patience. It was no longer just about survival. It was about waiting for an empire to collapse from the inside or strike from the outside. And in his heart, Abdullah likely knew that one day the battle would return. The question remained whether there would be anyone left to hold the second line behind him. But his answer to that was the same as it had always been. Remain firm, fear none but Allah, seek honor through sacrifice if needed. Others would compromise, others would bend their knees, but Abdullah ibn Zubair had made his decision long ago, even before Yazid, even before Karbala, even before Mecca. From the moment Uthman's blood marked the Quran, from the moment his father was murdered in prayer, from the moment he saw scholars silenced by gold, he had chosen this path. A sword cannot bend, and a man who is the son of the sword must be prepared to die holding it. He wasn't crowned in a grand palace, nor was his name chanted in the halls of power with opulence and gold. No formal coronation, no banners of empire, no armies lined like rows of marble. Yet across the corners of the fractured Islamic world, people began whispering and then declaring, Abdullah ibn Zubair is our leader, not because he declared himself one, not because he fought to grasp the Caliphate, but because he stood when others bowed. He refused when others crumbled. He did not seek Mecca as a stronghold. Mecca sought him, the same city from which his grandfather Abu Bakr once migrated, the same city where his father Zubair was honored and betrayed, now became his fortress, not from which to rule, but from which to protect sacred principles. After refusing allegiance to Yazid, Abdullah reorganized his life around something greater than rebellion, revival. He didn't want a title, he wanted a restoration. So while the Umayyads in Damascus bankrolled loyalty and enforced fear, Abdullah in Mecca governed with simplicity and faith. Word spread that he slept on straw mats, that he fasted so often people assumed he was ill, that his robe was patched, and when people tried to elevate him on lavish minbars, he insisted upon modest pulpits. He made no demands of the public treasury. He lit the lamps in the haram with his own oil. His governance was not a political machine. It was a personal example. When envoys came to negotiate, they found not a general in armor or a caliph on a throne, but often a man in sujood or reciting Quran behind a pillar in the mosque. His days were split between organizing the city and worshipping its Lord. And yet, from that simplicity, power flowed outward across the Ummah like a quiet current. One by one, provinces drifted toward him. Hijaz, Yemen, Iraq, Kufa, Basra, parts of Egypt and Khorasan. It wasn't done by force or threat, it was a choice. Governors, tribal leaders, advisors, some guided by conscience, others disillusioned with the Umayyad state, pledged allegiance to Abdullah ibn Zubair. They had seen what happened to Hussein. They had witnessed the destruction of the Kaaba. They had heard whispers of Yazid's indulgence and chaos in Damascus. And when they turned their eyes toward Mecca, they saw not rebellion, They saw the last flickering purity of true Islamic leadership. Mecca, in its holiness, became more than a city. It became a counter-caliphate, the spiritual seat of a new revival. And yet, as new governors issued pledges and khutbahs across distant lands began mentioning Abdullah's name, he never softened under the weight. While others would have rushed to declare dominion, Abdullah hesitated. He was cautious, measured. He told his followers repeatedly, if they only wanted to switch oppression for a new face, they had chosen the wrong man. His leadership wouldn't come with bloodthirsty conquests or forced conformity. It would come through dawah, justice, prayer, and example. He brought back consultations and the presence of scholars in the courts. He personally oversaw judgments. He listened. He asked. And most importantly, he led with iman, not force. In his eyes, there was no caliphate without Quran, no government without humility, no justice without piety. Soon, reformations began. Under Abdullah's rule, there were khutbahs given in his name, not Yazid's. This was no small thing. Mentioning a ruler's name in the Friday prayer sermon was a public declaration of political legitimacy. And Mecca, Medina, Yemen, Basra, Kufa, Egypt, they all echoed the same name, Abdullah ibn Zubair. The coinage changed too. New Islamic currency was minted under his domain, marking a shift from the Byzantine and Sassanid-style dinars once used in the region. His name appeared not just in documents, but in gold and silver, etched in history and circulated in the hands of common people. Even more symbolic than the coin was the ideology it carried. His rule breathed with the memory of the Khilafah, Rashida, the rightly guided caliphate, simplicity, service, sacrifice. But Abdullah was no fool. He knew what this growing allegiance meant. With every new pledge of support, a new enemy emerged. The Umayyads were not going to stand idly by, while an independent moral authority, the son of Zubair no less, gained momentum in the most sacred city on earth. And yet Abdullah never turned to fear. He pressed forward, not like a man preparing for war, but like a man preparing for death. His leadership came with that weight. He did not expect safety. He was never guarded by towers or lavish armies. His soldiers were few, but their hearts were firm. They were not defending a man. They were defending something Mecca had almost lost. Truth, grounded in legacy. People asked him why he didn't build a palace, why he didn't strengthen his army with contracts and promises like Muawiyah had. His reply: because the dunya tricks its lovers, but serves its slaves when they enslave it for Allah. He did not want monuments. He wanted Mecca to remember, not in stone but in soil, that a man had once risen here not to win, but to restore. And yet, deep inside, everyone knew this moment could not last. While trust bloomed in Mecca, plots thickened in Damascus. A new figure had emerged, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, wise, sharp, politically fierce, everything Yazid wasn't. He studied Abdullah's rise not with fear, but with strategy. He watched the loyalty of provinces shift, studied Abdullah's alliances, waited for his alliances to crumble, and all the while, he prepared. This wasn't just about reclaiming power. This was about extinguishing a symbol. Because as long as Abdullah ibn Zubair stood in Mecca, uncompromised, a Quran still glowing in the Haram, the Umayyads could never be fully secure. But in Mecca, under his minimal rule, Abdullah's power was still growing. His followers didn't grow because of conquest, but because of confidence. Those around him believed not in his strength, but in his stubborn refusal to sell his principles. And in a world of betrayal, that was the most valuable power of all. It was said that even at the height of his prominence, Abdullah never expanded his home, that his saddle was reused, that before making any decision, he would pray 2 rak'ahs and consult with the pious, and that when leadership overwhelmed him, he would walk alone at night, barefoot along the outskirts of the city, asking Allah whether he was doing the right thing. He was no longer just resisting Yazid. He was embodying a model of governance people hadn't seen since the days of Umar: faith without fraud, rulership without royalty, power without pride. And though the drums of empire grew louder outside the walls of Mecca, inside them, the azan was still being called, the Quran still echoed, and the light of a man raised among giants continued to shine, while the pillars of Mecca stood steady. Under the weight of his integrity, the world beyond those walls began to shift. The momentary unity that had spread under the symbolic leadership of Abdullah ibn Zubair began to fade, not because he changed, but because those around him did. Many of the provinces that had once pledged loyalty started to fall back into old habits, tribal preferences, political calculations, and fear. Cities like Kufa, so loud in support when speeches were cheap, turned silent when sacrifice was required. Syria solidified once again under the administrative brilliance of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, a man who represented everything Abdullah opposed: ruthless statecraft, authoritarian centralization, and the resurgence of dynastic power. Where Abdullah led through submission to Allah, Abdul Malik ruled through control over men. And in Damascus, that control was becoming absolute. Yet in Mecca, Abdullah remained unmoved. Even when news came that support was peeling away, that regions were reconsidering their allegiance, he still kept his hands away from politics as manipulation. His leadership was not about expanding power, but holding truth. He could see what was coming. His advisors begged him to negotiate, to strategize, to assert influence, but Abdullah refused. "Leadership is only a burden," he once said, "when truth is removed from its spine." He did not build bridges with corruption, and he did not fear the outcome of choosing God over gold. But he was no longer a young man. His beard had grayed. His body bore marks of campaigns past. His inner circle was thinning. And worse, the last companions of the Prophet were dying one by one. The emotional support of that first generation was disappearing, and a new ummah was emerging, less attached to the past, more drawn to power for its own sake. As this shift unfolded, Abdul Malik made his move. Knowing that direct murder of Abdullah might destabilize Mecca further, he crafted a plan not just of military superiority, but of psychological demoralization. He sent al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, a man of unmatched cruelty, brilliant discipline, and terrifying focus. Hajjaj was not known for his faithfulness or worship, but for his loyalty to the state and his ability to break opposition by any means necessary. He had no hesitation, no softness. Mecca, for him, was not sacred. It was a target. He arrived with an army, sealed off the city, and prepared for siege. Inside Mecca, Abdullah's ranks were small. Supplies were low. He had no backing from other territories, no hidden alliances. He was alone. His own brother Mus'ab ibn Zubair, who had governed in Iraq, had already been killed by Abdul Malik's forces, and the messages from across the lands had stopped coming. The people of Mecca remained with him, but even they were growing tired and starving. The siege dragged on for months. Food became scarce. Every house was filled with grief. Arrows darkened. The sky, launched by catapults, aimed not just at city walls, but toward the Kaaba itself. Again, the house of Allah, for the second time in Abdullah's life, became a battleground. Except now, it wasn't rebellion being punished. It was piety being erased. And still, Abdullah refused to surrender. He had every excuse: his age, his fatigue, the hunger of Mecca's people, the historical irony that Mecca, a sanctuary of peace, was now a literal war zone. But he would not give in, because to him, giving allegiance to Abdul Malik was not a political necessity. It was a betrayal of everything he, his parents, and the Prophet had taught him. It was reported that in those final days he prayed longer, spoke less, and made more dhikr than he had ever done, as though preparing to meet his Lord. He didn't argue with those who deserted him. He didn't curse the soldiers surrounding Mecca. He simply prepared. And the one person he allowed close during his last moments of leadership was his mother, Asma bint Abu Bakr. Now an old woman, blind with age but sharp in faith, Asma had raised Abdullah from the day he was born during the Prophet's hijrah. She had taught him to honor truth, to guard faith, to bow only to Allah. When she heard his voice asking whether she thought he should give in to Abdul Malik's offer of safety, with surrender, she responded not as a mother fearing for her son's life, but as a believer fearing for his afterlife. She told him that if he fought and died truthful, she would meet him again in Jannah. But if he surrendered, she would never look him in the face again. She recited to him the bravery of his grandfather, the dignity of Abu Bakr, and reminded him, what is victory in this dunya if your soul is bought? Abdullah performed ghusl, put on his best armor, and led one final prayer in the haram. As arrows rained over the city, he walked calmly forward. His final stand was not cinematic. There was no dramatic victory, no last-minute savior. It was silence, resistance, and death. After fierce fighting, Abdullah ibn Zubair fell, sword in hand, face untwisted by fear, body broken, but spirit untouched. Hajjaj had him crucified outside Mecca, left his body exposed for days. Even in death, they tried to humiliate him, but they couldn't stain his sacrifice. Later, his mother came, blind but aware. She stood beneath her son's suspended body and said, "You have honored us, son, and they have shamed their world and ruined their akhirah." In death, Abdullah ibn Zubair became what he was in life, an emblem, not of power, but of principle, an echo of a generation that held the Quran before it held swords, that governed hearts before ruling lands. He never ruled the entire empire, but he ruled with a backbone that dynasties couldn't match. He lived on patched clothes, he governed from the mosque, he fasted when his enemies feasted, and when the world offered him submission dressed in safety, he chose danger dressed in dignity. His story is not one of global conquests or architectural legacies. It is simply the story of a man who guarded the house of God with his life. And that is a legacy even kings would envy. It was Hajj season, those sacred weeks when swords were meant to drop, when voices softened and hearts turned to the Kaaba in silence. Across the Ummah, pilgrims were preparing to answer Allah's call, dressing in white, leaving behind the dunya to meet their Lord in surrender. But this year, an army was marching instead of pilgrims. and its orders came not from the gates of heaven, but from the throne of Yazid. The Caliph, rattled by Abdullah ibn Zubair's growing moral and political influence, decided Mecca needed to be dealt not with negotiations, but with fire. Yazid, son of Muawiyah, had already seen the cracks forming in his empire after the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali at Karbala. The world was angry, Medina was boiling, and now Mecca had declared itself independent, refusing to recognize his authority. Yazid's advisors warned him, if Abdullah consolidates Mecca, if more provinces rally to him, you'll lose the entire Hijaz, and with it, your legitimacy. The Caliph didn't just want silence, he wanted submission. So he sent a massive force under Hussein ibn Numayya with explicit orders to crush Abdullah's resistance and take Mecca by any means necessary. And so a dark chapter in Islamic history began, not in a battlefield, but in a city built for prayer. As the army encircled Mecca, Abdullah knew what was coming. He didn't run. He didn't prepare for diplomacy. He didn't invite allies. He stood. With his back to the haram and his soul tied to Allah, he refused to flee or surrender, forcing the siege to be not against a rebellious city, but against the very sanctuary of Islam. Mecca's gates were closed. Supplies were gathered. Fighters and residents took shelter near the Masjid al-Haram. The population of Mecca wasn't made of soldiers, but now every man, woman, elder and child felt the tremor of an empire pressing down. For Hussein ibn Numayya, the sacredness of Mecca was a minor detail, not a barrier. His men began setting up catapults outside the city, massive siege engines, crafted from imported timber and steel. These weren't just tools of war, they were weapons of desecration. They faced not castles or outposts, but the Kaaba herself. And then the impossible happened. The army launched. Rocks the size of millstones were launched into Mecca, smashing rooftops, collapsing homes, and tearing into the Haram. Fire arrows were loosed across the night sky. The sound of takbir inside the mosque was drowned beneath the scream of flaming projectiles. Then came the moment that would stain the legacy of Yazid's rule forever. The kiswa, the black cloth that draped the Kaaba, was set alight, and as flames engulfed the sacred structure's rooftop beams, the skyline of Mecca glowed like a battlefield. Smoke rose from the house of Allah, and the people of Mecca wept. Abdullah ibn Zubair didn't panic. He stood among his people. He took up arms alongside them. He fortified vulnerable neighborhoods, dug trenches and blockades. He refused to hide. In those days, Mecca became a paradox, a city under invasion that continued calling the azan, continued praying congregation. Salah continued fasting. The Haram echoed with Quran even as arrows fell into its walls. It was a war zone unlike any ever seen before, and Abdullah, it was said, slept so little that his companions saw him only at dusk, pacing the mosque with his armor loosely tied, whispering dhikr, while fires burned just outside the walls. He wasn't just defending a city, he was defending an idea that no worldly ruler would ever own the house of Allah. This siege shattered the image many Muslims had of their spiritual safety. For the first time, believers witnessed the horrifying reality that even the Kaaba was not safe from political greed. It wasn't Romans or Persians attacking. These were Muslims, soldiers from the Ummah, men who read the same Quran, prayed the same way. And in their eyes, surrendering Mecca to Yazid's authority was obedience. But to Abdullah, it was blasphemy camouflaged as order. This rebellion was not for territory, it was for dignity. The political lines blurred under the smoke, but the moral stakes never changed. Mecca wasn't just under siege from catapults, it was under siege from its own people, companions, some with honor, some with fear, were on both sides of this fracture. Households divided, bloodlines severed, and in the middle, the Kaaba stood scorched, still sobbing stone if only it could speak. As the days extended into weeks, food ran low, medical supplies dwindled, the people began weakening, children cried in hunger, elderly fell from illness, traders couldn't enter. Hajj caravans who had come earlier tried desperately to navigate the chaos, but the rituals of pilgrimage now blurred into the rhythm of war. Even tawaf around the Kaaba became difficult. Some say that during the most intense nights of fighting, Abdullah stood beside the burned kiswa, holding it in his hands, silently listening to the Quran being recited, his lips moving, but saying nothing out loud. His silence became a shield stronger than any wall. He knew the symbolism. If he fell, Yazid's rule wouldn't just kill a man, it would conquer Mecca as a precedent, and that could never be allowed. And then, without warning, Yazid died. News came to the army outside Mecca like a blade through their own ranks. The Caliph has fallen. For a day, they paused. Then they argued. Who would replace him? Was the siege still valid? Would they be punished for killing a man inside the haram now that the ruler himself was dead? For the first time since the catapults were raised, the Umayyad army hesitated, and in that hesitation, the siege cracked. Negotiations began, not with honor or apology, but with retreat. The army pulled back. The catapults were abandoned, fires were extinguished, soldiers faded into the hills surrounding Mecca, and the smoke that had darkened the Quran's verses lifted, but the scars remained. The Kaaba stood blackened, its walls cracked, its covering burned. Mecca was not conquered, but it had been wounded by hands that claimed Islam and hearts that obeyed monarchs more than revelation. And Abdullah ibn Zubair remained, bloodied, exhausted, surrounded by martyrs, but alive. The people clung to him now, not just for leadership, but for survival. As Yazid's empire crumbled momentarily, and the Muslim world paused in breathless horror, Abdullah stood atop the rubble, not as a man celebrating survival, but as the last defender of a house that belonged to no king. After the army retreated and the catapults fell silent, Mecca exhaled, but it was not relief, it was grief. The city had survived, but in surviving, it had been scarred in ways deeper than stone. The Kaaba, burned and cracked, stood like a wounded soul at the center of a shaken people. Children walked quietly through streets still littered with shattered walls and arrowheads. The nights were filled not with chatter, but the whispers of people asking themselves if this attack on the holiest sanctuary of Islam was truly the price they had to pay for refusing a tyrant. But in the silence, one man still stood, tall. Abdullah ibn Zubair had endured, and more than that, he had kept the haram unconquered. He had not bent. His companions, some of whom were buried while still holding swords in their hands, had sealed the moment with their blood. And now, without Yazid breathing down their necks, Mecca found an opportunity, however brief, for breath. With the death of Yazid in 683 CE, the Umayyad succession became fragile, almost laughable in its clumsiness. Yazid's son, Muawiyah II, briefly assumed power, but he lacked the charisma, alliances, and legitimacy his father had enjoyed, and his reign was short-lived. Before the Umayyads could regroup under a new strong leader, the Islamic world entered a moment of pause, a vacuum, and into that pause stepped the only man who had stood firm while the rest crumbled. In the eyes of the people, the only name with true moral authority now, the only figure who had risked life and blood for principle, was Abdullah ibn Zubayr. He didn't announce a victory speech. He didn't take captives. He didn't parade himself through the streets. He simply cleaned the dust from his clothing, rebuilt what he could, and prayed beside the burned walls of the Kaaba. Reports say that one of Abdullah's first acts after the siege was not military or political. It was sacred. He initiated the rebuilding of the Kaaba. The Prophet had once said that if Quraysh hadn't been so close to the days of ignorance, he would have rebuilt the Kaaba on the original foundation of Ibrahim. Now, with the damage done, Abdullah saw his chance to honor that vision. He redesigned the Kaaba based on the prophetic blueprint, adding a second door and reshaping it to its original outline. He wasn't just restoring stone, he was restoring memory, symbolism, and this act stirred hearts across the Ummah. Even those distant from Mecca heard the news and paused. Here was a man who didn't just fight for Mecca. He rebuilt it, both in structure and in spirit. And so for a while, peace returned. Not everywhere, but here. Pilgrims came again, slowly, cautiously. Trade routes reopened under his protection. Letters arrived from leaders, scholars, and distant governors pledging allegiance to Abdullah ibn Zubayr, not just as a warrior, but as a caliph. Yet he held the position with the same humility that had defined him during war. He sat among scholars in the mosque. He listened more than he spoke. On Fridays, when his name was mentioned in khutbahs far away in Basra or Yemen, he wept quietly, fully aware of the burden that came with remembrance. But in the background, the storm had not passed. It had only moved. While Abdullah strengthened, Mecca through faith and reform, a different kind of strength was growing in Damascus. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan rose to power, methodical, ambitious, a political mastermind who knew how to build an empire with discipline. Unlike Yazid, Abdul Malik didn't act out of desperation. He calculated. He waited. And in that wait, he re-established the Umayyad grip on Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Slowly, inch by inch, provinces that had once acknowledged Ibn Zubayr's rule now reverted, not necessarily out of disloyalty, but out of survival. The world was shifting, and though Mecca stood tall in faith, it stood increasingly alone in the world of realpolitik. During this fragile period, Abdullah was presented a choice. He could submit to Abdul Malik's authority, keep Mecca safe, even remain governor under the Umayyad regime with honor, wealth, and the illusion of continued leadership. Many would have taken that offer. Even some of his supporters advised him to consider it. Times had changed, they said. Empires needed structure. The goal was achieved. Power was just formality. Why keep resisting when you've already won the people's hearts? But Abdullah was not built to serve appearances. He was either servant to Allah or to no one. He refused, again. Not with swords or slogans, but with the same dignity that had carried him since the beginning. That refusal made him dangerous. Again. Once more, the dagger of power turned toward Mecca, and this time, the blade would be sharper. Abdul Malik sent the one man who would have no sympathy, who would never hesitate, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Hajjaj's name struck fear even in hardened soldiers. Known for his precision, cruelty, and absolute loyalty to Umayyad authority, he would not lay siege like the haphazard commanders before him. His siege would be total. Abdullah suspected it was coming. He continued his leadership as though war wasn't looming, but in his heart he knew. This time, no miracle would stop the arrows. No caliph would die mid-siege. This time, he would have to decide how he would leave Mecca, alive through surrender or dead through sacrifice. In the days before the second siege would begin, people noticed a change in Abdullah. Not fear, not retreat, but a deepening calm. He began praying longer into the nights, fasting more, spending more time in solitary dhikr. He wrote small letters to friends, spoke gently to strangers, and began speaking more openly with his mother, Asma. A friend who witnessed him during this time would later say, it was as if he was rehearsing death, but not with fear, with preparation. What none of them knew, what history did not yet realize, is that the second siege of Mecca would not just be about politics or territory this time. It would be about legacy, and whether Abdullah ibn Zubair would truly stand alone when there was no one left to hold the gates with him. The fire that had consumed Mecca still smoldered in its walls, but in the political landscape of the Muslim world, another fire was dying, the fire of the Umayyad grip. Yazid was dead, his sudden passing, as if snapped from power by a hand greater than his own, created a silence across the empire, a vacuum in the seat of the Caliphate. With his heir unprepared and unwilling, chaos spread through the Umayyad ranks. For a brief moment in the aftermath of siege and rebellion, it seemed the world had reset. The throne in Damascus trembled. Provinces no longer recognized the authority that had violated the Kaaba. People asked questions that no ruler wanted to hear. Who is left to lead us? Who stood when others fell? Who remained when compromise hollowed out the Ummah? And every eye, wounded and weary, slowly turned south. Not to a new military commander, but to the only man who didn't abandon his principles, Abdullah ibn Zubair. He didn't seek their gaze. He didn't parade himself as victor, but he became what Yazid never was, a symbol of conscience, of faith, of resistance grounded in sacred purpose. Mecca was no longer a city under siege. It became a capital, not just political, but moral. The Kaaba stood again, freshly rebuilt by Abdullah's own hand, its stones once bathed in fire, now softened by supplication. Over time, delegations from cities arrived. Yemen pledged allegiance. Basra sent word. Egypt acknowledged his leadership. The Hijaz was fully behind him. Even Khorasan whispered his name in khutbahs. Cities in Iraq offered him their hand, not because of conquest, but because of character. For a moment in history, Islam's leadership tilted toward purity once again, and Abdullah, still in patched garments, still fasting often, still surrounded by students and scholars instead of bodyguards and viziers, bore the pressure of power with the same quiet conviction he'd always carried. There were no palaces. In Mecca, no armies parading in formation. Just a city that was still healing, and a man who acted more like a custodian of truth than a sovereign over men. Coins were minted in his name. His name was proclaimed in khutbahs across the growing domains under his rule. The people referred to him plainly as Amir al-Mu'minin. But power, especially when earned by principle, attracts rivals who serve nothing but purpose. In the ashes of Yazid's crumbling dynasty rose a man who would define the next era, Marwan ibn al-Hakam. An Umayyad elder, politically sharp and rooted in ambition, he seized control in Damascus where others hesitated. Though he didn't rule long, he prepared the way for someone far more dangerous, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, his son. Unlike Yazid, Abdul Malik was no indulgent prince. He was calculating, methodical, and educated. Before power, he had been a man of worship. After power, he became an unrivaled strategist. He did not seek to debate Abdullah. He sought to erase him. The landscape shifted slowly but decisively. Abdul Malik stabilized Syria, then he moved on Iraq. He restructured his army, silenced his opponents, and began recapturing loyalty province by province. He didn't offer moral arguments, he offered order. While Abdullah relied on justice, Abdul Malik built a machine. He brought fear where faith had failed and loyalty where logic had collapsed. City by city, bit by bit, the Umayyads began to strangle the areas that had once stood under Abdullah's banner. The slow collapse of support wasn't sudden or public. It was quiet, heartbreaking. One day, a loyal governor would stop sending letters. Another day, a pledge of loyalty would arrive to Damascus. In Iraq, where emotional rebellion always eclipsed long-term stability, tribal divisions tore at the unity Abdullah had once inspired. Conflicts that had nothing to do with faith, but everything to do with power, began to distract the people. Kufa argued with Basra. Technocrats displaced scholars. And in that fog of ambition, Abdullah's name, once spoken with conviction, now echoed more as memory than rallying cry. Rebellions broke out under his name, but without his permission. Men who had their own nuances of anger began claiming legitimacy from his purity, confusing his name with movements he didn't initiate. It weakened his moral stronghold. People began asking, is Abdullah still leading? Is he still safe in Mecca? Is he even aware of what's happening across the provinces in his name? The illusion of control distorted the truth. He was still standing firm, still leading with dignity. But the world outside Mecca was not built to serve dignity alone. It needed power. And power, once consolidated in Damascus under Abdul Malik, became the only language cities seemed to understand. Back in Mecca, Abdullah saw it happening. Slowly, tragically, he felt the isolation grow. Where once his barakah carried the voices of thousands, now only the shadows of empty promises remained. Yet he did not despair. He did not waver. He still ruled with honesty, still prayed between decisions, still taught in the haram. Some of his companions encouraged negotiation. Even his closest advisors suggested the possibility of compromise. But he rejected it with words calm and unshaken. When I stand before Allah, I do not want the blood of betrayal on my hands. In that statement lay his burden, because he was not merely a political figure, he was a moral weight. Not many leaders are buried because they refused corruption. Fewer still are buried as the last ones to resemble the glory of the rightfully guided ones. Abdullah ibn Zubair had become that man. And somewhere deep within him, he likely knew, There was no rescue coming, no miracle army, no twist in history. He would not be remembered for reclaiming Damascus. He would be remembered for refusing to let Mecca fall again. As time passed, the stark contrast between Damascus and Mecca became impossible to ignore. In the north, under Abdul Malik, the Umayyad dynasty was evolving into an empire, structured, militarized, financially secured. Gold flowed, borders were fortified, and scribes rewrote the narrative to favor singular authority. Coins carried his name. Judges ruled in his interest. Administrators swept through cities cleaning dissent not with dialogue, but with decrees. And in Mecca, a long-bearded man still walked the mosque barefoot, dressed in worn clothes, breaking his fast with dry dates and water, giving verdicts not to please the state, but to obey Allah. Where Damascus chased domination, Mecca held on to devotion. Yet time is a ruthless test, because even when truth is clear, people gravitate toward what promises them comfort. Security, feed the governors, arm the soldiers, silence the poets, buy the scholars. That was the Umayyad formula. In contrast, Abdullah offered no bribes, no titles, no favoritism. He called to righteousness while the world was rushing toward results. And in the marketplace of rushed victories, his sincerity began to look like failure. Worse than political decline was emotional betrayal. One by one, the same cities that once chanted his name began falling silent. Leaders who had publicly stood beside him began choosing the easier path, merging with the growing muscle of Abdul Malik's machine. In Iraq, rebellions flared and fizzled under his name, but without his command. The chaos worked against him. Every faction trying to use his legitimacy only made it easier for Umayyad propaganda to paint his rule as weak, fractured, disorganized. He was never weak, but now he had only Mecca, a few loyal cities nearby, and the walls of a sanctuary being circled again by destiny. He still ruled, still received guests, still prayed by the Kaaba, but fewer dared speak of him as Caliph. The term now belonged to Abdul Malik on the tongues of scribes and clerics who had once hesitated. His hold on Syria and Iraq was total. Egypt was aligned. Yemen was lost. Of the provinces that once drifted toward Abdullah like lost birds seeking pure air, only the inner Hijaz remained. And so did he. Some of his allies urged him to escape. Travel to the east, they advised. Gather a new army. Start again. He refused. This wasn't pride. It was principle. If leadership was never a goal for me, why abandon honor to protect it now? He'd say. The way he saw it, Mecca didn't need him alive for glory. It needed him unchanged to the end, because once he compromised, the flame of that prophetic integrity would die with him. But revolutions don't survive on memory alone, and Abdul Malik was not just planning, he was acting. Behind the walls of Damascus, he released a name that would be seared into Islamic memory: Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, a master of control, disciplined, cruel, emotionally detached. Hajjaj didn't come with a message, he came with conquest. He spoke little and listened even less. When sent to Kufa to suppress unrest, he led Jummah prayer wielding a sword and began his khutbah by saying, "I fastened my belt with blood and entered with obedience." Now he was being prepared for a greater target, Mecca itself. Again, as Mecca began to hear whispers, as riders passed through markets with strange accents and unfamiliar commands, the people felt their stomachs sink. They had lived this pain before: siege, hunger, smoke, the Kaaba burning, their children asking for bread, their women crying into clay jars. This time, there was more dread because they knew the playbook. They had seen what the empire was capable of. Some began to leave early. Others begged Abdullah to yield for the sake of the harem. He smiled gently and asked them, "Did you think we were safe because the devil sleeps?" He carried himself like a man who knew the road ahead. Every step felt like walking into history with open eyes. Still, he did not raise panic. He met with his men, checked supplies, refreshed guard posts, repaired his armor, but he did not prepare to run. The people noticed something else about him in those days. He smiled more, not broadly, not in joy, but with a strange lightness, like one who has made peace with something others fear. A friend once asked him if he thought victory was still possible. His reply was chilling in its clarity. "Victory has already happened. We stood. We spoke truth. That's enough." Letters from Abdul Malik arrived one last time through messengers. Promises were made. Land, position, honor among the rulers, even safety for his family. Even Hajjaj supposedly pressured Abdul Malik to offer peace publicly before war. It was political theater. Abdullah was unmoved. His responses, always in writing, always brief, reminded the Caliph that allegiance belonged to Allah and that no man who burned the Kaaba would ever deserve bay'ah while he still breathed. The empire had its answer, and so Hajjaj mobilized. With precision, he reorganized supplies, sealed the borders, and began surrounding Mecca again. This time, there would be no retreat. Hajjaj wasn't coming to siege, he was coming to strike. The final confrontation between the last man of principle and the first empire of permanence was no longer a theory. It was inevitable. And inside the walls of that holy city, Abdullah was already preparing, not for battle alone, but for death. He didn't confine himself to meetings or military drills. He increased his prayer, strengthened his dhikr, spent hours sitting near the burned section of the Kaaba where he had once wept after the Umayyads flung fire into the sky. He studied the faces of children in the haram, held the palms of warriors. And when a young soldier asked him why he was so calm, he said, "Isn't it better to meet Allah with your forehead on his ground than your hand in oppression's pocket?" Abdullah ibn Zubair, the last lantern of prophetic leadership, the son of the sword, the nephew of the purest woman in the Ummah, knew that history would not applaud him loudly. Tyrants write records louder than scholars. But he also knew that every man eventually stands alone beneath the throne, and he would rather stand there stained with blood than smeared with betrayal. The walls whispered of it before the horns were blown. Mecca had seen war before, and now it braced again. Not in confusion this time, but with grim certainty. Al-Hajjaj Ibn Yusuf had begun his approach, and there was no doubt what he had come for. His name alone darkened air. A man who spoke in threats and ruled with silence. Hajjaj wasn't seeking dialogue or debate. He was a sword forged for the hand of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and that sword was now unsheathed over Mecca. He came not with excuses or mercy, but with structure, strategy, and orders that echoed like steel on stone. End the rebellion, take Mecca, kill the man who dares call himself Caliph. Abdullah ibn Zubair did not retreat. He did not send an ambassador. He stood inside the haram, knowing full well what Hajjaj was capable of. The first siege years ago had been chaos, driven by fear and fatigue under Yazid. This was different. This was surgical, premeditated, ruthless. Hajjaj encompassed the city like a tightening noose. Roads were blocked, wells were seized, rations intercepted, supplies stopped, and not a single arrow was fired at first. Not until the arteries of Mecca had been starved dry. As days passed, and then weeks, cries rose inside the city, not from soldiers, but from children. Starvation gripped like frost. Bread became myths. Olive oil a luxury. Mothers tightened belts around their stomachs so their children could sleep a few more hours without hearing hunger scream inside them. And in the middle of it all, Abdullah ibn Zubair stood fasting. The people of Mecca, once roaring in loyalty, began to whisper. Young men once proud to fight under Abdullah's banner now asked if the siege would ever end. Even his commanders began to divide between those loyal to the idea of resistance and those loyal only to survival. Trapped between loyalty to the man who protected Mecca and the reality of their starving children, many began to make a choice. They deserted. Some did it quietly. Others justified it openly. Yet Abdullah never raised blame. When men asked to leave, he nodded. When arms were dropped at his feet, he whispered dua for those who had tried. After all these years, his strength had never depended on numbers. It had always rested in conviction. Though surrounded, weakened, and silently abandoned piece by piece, he remained unshaken. His only companions now were his prayers and his sword. When Hajjaj's catapults began to rise on the hills around Mecca again, the memories of the first siege returned like ghosts dancing in firelight. But this time, the Umayyad strategy wasn't rushed. Every missile had a purpose. The bombardment began slowly, loud, brutal, terrifying. Stones rained from the sky like divine wrath twisted by men. Arrows fell upon courtyards, homes crumbled, and the Kaaba yet again became a battlefield. Her black cloth shivering under smoke trails, her walls chipped by steel and siege. But she stood, and beside her, so did Abdullah. That year, Abdullah's brothers, often his final layer of mortal support, were killed. Their deaths didn't come with fanfare. They came quietly, swallowed by the siege, marking stone and soul together. Around him, dust coated the holy ground, blood dried along columns of the mosque. The same place where Quran once echoed peacefully now trembled under the screams of burning roofs. Every moment felt like the world closing, a city gasping under weight it could no longer hold. Inside the battlefield, Abdullah turned not to cruelty or command, but to silence, a deadly, noble silence. He fasted during the day, prayed during the night, recited Quran by candlelight, woke before dawn to wash his face with Zamzam and stare into the black sky where stars seemed to dim. That man, exhausted, hungry, burdened, but still present, would not disappear. As his army crumbled, as the Ummah betrayed its conscience again, only one voice cut through the shadows. His mother, Asma bint Abi Bakr, now old, now blind, but still iron-willed, she called for her son. When he entered her room, dust still clinging to his shoulders, she sensed his struggle, not with swords, but with the unbearable loneliness of leadership. She could feel the war hanging from his breath. He told her he feared the people were abandoning him. that the swords were too many, that it was no longer possible to win, and she, firmer than most men, reminded him of the legacy he carried. You are the son of Zubair and the grandson of Abu Bakr. If you are killed upon truth, what more do you want? She said. If you live humiliated, how will I meet the faces of your ancestors? He kissed her forehead and returned to the mosque. The defenders were now few, numbered perhaps in the dozens. Some say he knew them by name, perhaps even shared dates and shawls between skirmishes. Each night, one more voice would fall silent. In the mornings, the gates shook louder, and yet, on the final Fridays, he still led prayers. He still climbed the pulpit, still reminded whomever remained that this was not a rebellion. It was a stand for the sanctity of sacred space. When asked whether he thought Hajjaj would offer him another chance at life, he said, "Yes, but at the cost of my dignity." And that was not a price he would ever pay. The Kaaba itself was now surrounded. Dust hung thick in the air, as if the city no longer breathed, and standing beneath her shadow was the last soul who refused to kneel. Abdullah ibn Zubair, armed, alone, and free. He knew the end would come, not as a surprise, not as a betrayal, in the dark, but as a slow march, one measured step after another, the world closing in around him like waves against a firm rock that refused to erode. On the final night before his death, Abdullah ibn Zubair prepared not for battle, but for meeting his Lord. He bathed. He prayed with such stillness that those around him wept, even the few who remained, loyal to him until the end. He wore his best armor, not the newest, but the most worn, the one that had carried him through victories, loss, and unveiled truths. It wasn't just cloth and steel, it was testimony, a record of a life spent not in pursuit of the world, but in submission to the one who created it. Before the dawn would rise, some say he recited long portions of the Quran, his voice trembling inside the broken walls of the Haram, as if calling not for survival, but witness. The stones of Mecca had seen kings, empires, and prophets, but now they watched a man prepare for martyrdom, not with pride, but peace. The sun rose slowly, dragging across the sky like a curtain lifting on the final act of a great tragic play. Hajjaj's army was ready. The men had their instructions. Take the city, take the man. No long speeches, no negotiations. End it. Hajjaj, from his high command, watched the city that had defied everything he represented. His soldiers moved in formations, storming the weakened barricades, sweeping through alleys once guarded by men who had either died with their swords or disappeared during the long choke of siege. The sound of war returned to Mecca, not the roar of opposing armies, but the beat of an empire crushing the last pulse of opposition. And through the clouds of dust, Abdullah stood alone. His final stand came not with an army, not with banners or shouts of rally. It came in armor weighed down by time and righteousness, in hands familiar with both the Quran and the hilt of a sword. Some say he fought like the companions did, at Barda, quietly, purposefully, every strike filled with meaning beyond the physical. He struck because surrendering would not just be a surrender of land or name, it would be a surrender of principle. What is a life, he had once said, if it is lived by lowering your eyes to injustice? What is leadership if it trembles before tyranny? There would be no bargains on this day. No dream of last-minute victory, only resistance as worship and martyrdom as celebration. The confrontation didn't last long. It couldn't. Abdullah had no soldiers left. The few that stood beside him fell quickly, one by one, some holding Qurans, some gripping weapons, all knowing that their deaths would not be forgotten. The city could not save him. The Ummah didn't lift a hand. But he didn't ask them to. This was a death he chose long ago when he refused to give bay'ah to Yazid, when he rebuilt the Kaaba, when he stood against siege, betrayal, starvation, and political pressure. When he placed submission to Allah above survival, he wrote his own ending. And now it had arrived. He was captured, struck down beneath the sacred skyline, his body falling near the very house he had defended twice, in war and in legacy. The killing blow did not land upon a criminal or rebel. It landed upon the last man who dared lead not for power, but for principle. And yet, death could not silence him. Hajjaj, in his cruelty and in his need to make a statement, ordered Abdullah's body to be crucified, strung up in full view, a warning to anyone who might dream of dissent. His corpse hung on display for days beside the roads leading to Mecca. And yet, no one passed without tremble, without sorrow, without realizing that it wasn't fear that stood on the cross, but dignity. News spread fast and reached the ears of one person who hadn't left Mecca, Asma, his mother. Blind but aware, old but unwavering, she asked where they had hung her son. They told her, fearing her reaction. She stood tall, demanding to be led to the place. They tried to dissuade her. She insisted. As she reached the site where her son's body was crucified, she asked for silence. Then, with the voice of a mother, a scholar, a companion, and a believer, she spoke. "You have ruined this world for him, and he has ruined your hereafter." Her words cut deeper than any sword ever could. They echoed through the politics, through the horror, through the hearts of men who still remembered what Islam was meant to be. Later, Hajjaj, perhaps seeking to tidy history, requested her, "Speak well of the Caliph," implying Abdul Malik. Asma turned her face from him. "I cannot praise a man who sent someone like you to kill the people of Allah in a sacred place." She walked away, having buried more than a son. She buried the last symbol of a righteous stand, the final echo of the prophetic generation. And yet, neither Hajjaj nor Abdul Malik nor any army after them could erase what Abdullah ibn Zubair left behind. He never ruled an empire. He never held absolute power. But he held the line when no one else would. He faced tyranny with the Quran in one hand and truth in the other. His was not a reign of glory. It was a reign of resistance. And in a world that bows too easily, sometimes standing is the greatest form of leadership. In his blood, in the cracked stones of Mecca, in the burned walls of the Kaaba, his story was written not in ink, but in conviction. Abdullah ibn Zubair, son of Asma, grandson of Abu Bakr, defender of the Haram, died alone, but his honor lives in every heart that still values what it means to say no when the weight of falsehood crushes down. Not every caliph is remembered, but every martyr lives forever. The night before a man dies tells you more about who he truly is than the entire life that came before. And on the final night of Abdullah ibn Zubair's life, there were no speeches, no written declarations, no dramatic final orders, only serenity. he knew what was coming. The siege had crushed nearly every hope of victory. Food was gone. Defenders were gone. Even the last strands of political support beyond Mecca had dissolved. But Abdullah didn't pace in worry like a nervous general. He didn't strategize or bargain or pray for some last-minute miracle. Instead, he performed ghusl, a full-body purification for prayer. With his own hands, he cleansed the dust from his skin, the fatigue from his limbs. The remnants of years of resistance burned into his muscles. Some who watched couldn't understand it. There was no army left to lead. Why the ghusl? But Abdullah was not preparing to fight. He was preparing to meet Allah. When he finished, he dried calmly. Then, deliberately and without hesitation, he put on the most worn armor he owned. Not the finest, not the newest, but the one that had shielded his body while his soul had carried a wounded ummah. He didn't just wear it, he honored it, as if it had been a companion in the struggle, not just metal. Then, in the echo of a city turned to ruin, he walked toward the Kaaba, not as a leader, not even as a warrior, but as a worshipper. He stood before the house of Allah, face turned upward, body still, heart torch-lit. He prayed as he had always, prayed in awe, in surrender, in stillness. But this time, it wasn't the world behind him he was leaving in sujud. It was himself. It was said his voice trembled more than usual as he recited long passages of the Quran. Not because of fear, but because the moment was too heavy even for him. This was not just any death on the horizon. This was a death in the Haram, in the place where angels descend, where revelation once echoed through the valleys, and where the Prophet had once walked beside his grandfather Abu Bakr's shoulders. Abdullah had protected this sacred place before, but now it wouldn't survive the siege. He would, not in flesh, but in legacy. There was still one person who could look him in the eyes like a child, someone who had held his hand when the Prophet used to sit beside him. That person was his mother, Asma bint Abu Bakr. She was now more than 100 years old, blind, heavy with both years and wisdom. And though her eyes were dim, her spirit blazed brighter than anyone alive. On that night, she knew her son sought her heart one last time. He sat beside her and gently spoke. She could hear the war cracking the earth outside. She could feel the sorrow in his voice. He asked her, hesitantly, if he should surrender, if he should walk into Hajjaj's terms and save what remained. Her reply cut through centuries. She turned her blind gaze toward him and said, "You are the son of Zubair and the grandson of Abu Bakr. A man like you does not surrender to oppression. If you die upon truth, then what a sweet death it will be. But if you live bowing to tyranny, how will I look your forefathers in the face?" That was all he needed. One sentence. From the woman who raised him. From the woman who had once torn her belt into two straps to deliver food to the Prophet in the cave of Thar. From the woman who had lived through all four caliphs, witnessed the fall of the Ummah, and still believed that truth was worth dying for. Their conversation ended, not with tears but with silence, the kind of silence only warriors and saints can share. Asma didn't ask him to run, and he didn't ask her for comfort. They had crossed beyond that. When he stood to leave, she held his hand for a moment. Then she let it go. And Abdullah walked into the final dawn of his life with a face that no longer blinked at the sight of Hajjaj's weapons. Only a few remained with him. Some say 30, some say less. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were shadows standing for faith. Together, they prepared for the last clash within Mecca's bleeding walls. But this war wasn't just about numbers. It was about a man who would not die until he could stand before his Creator, knowing he did not kneel before creation. All the oppression, all the betrayal, all the deceit and unraveled alliances left behind. Before the sun reached its peak, Abdullah ibn Zubair would be cloaked in dust and blood, in armor and hunger, with Quran in his heart and martyrdom at his doorstep. But when he looked at the Kaaba one final time, it said his lips moved, once more, not in panic, but in gratitude, because he knew he had defended this house not with an army, but with his life. As the gates of the Haram opened to a smoky, blood-scented morning, Abdullah ibn Zubair stepped into the day of judgment that history would record. Though he himself already believed it belonged only to Allah, he walked with calm steps, knowing his fate had already been written, not by leaders or armies, but by the very principles he chose never to abandon. His sword was sheathed along his back, not in vanity, but in silence. Most of his loyal companions had either been martyred or scattered. The few remaining were by now fasting, broken in body, but inspired by his presence. They had no hopes of defeating the siege. The siege wasn't over Mecca anymore. The war was now for the memory of Islam's true leadership, and Abdullah had already won the part that mattered. They say he stood alone for a moment, beneath what remained of the Kaaba's shade. The same Kaaba he had rebuilt, the same Kaaba he had defended, once covered in smoke from Umayyad flame. Now it watched him one final time, cut off from the world, but attached to heaven. As enemy soldiers swarmed the Masjid al-Haram from every entrance, pouring in with Hajjaj's ruthless dispatches, Abdullah didn't run. He was seen on the battlefield like a mountain among fleeing leaves. Every swing of his sword was not desperate. It was meaningful, controlled, heavy with years of conviction stored into every muscle. One by one he struck, not wildly, but with the precision of a man who knew this wasn't about survival. It was about sending Allah his final truth with blood in his veins and dignity in his grip. The field collapsed around him. The sacred city fell silent again as swords lowered and dust cleared. Abdullah ibn Zubair had been killed. There was no trumpet blast, no cry of victory from the invaders, just the heavy silence of a believer's body lying face down at the edge of the Haram, with the echoes of Quran still trapped in the air like dew that wouldn't fall. The man who had once governed the Hijaz, who had once had his name mentioned in khutbahs from Egypt to Persia, now lay with no banner left, no man beside him, but with a legacy millions would secretly love and fear to follow all at once. But Al-Hajjaj wasn't satisfied with death. He needed an example. For an empire to control hearts, it must desecrate legends. So he ordered Abdullah's body to be hoisted, crucified upright, nailed along the road into Mecca for all to see. No burial, just exposure, just mockery, just the broken body of Islam's last free man, left to dry under the sun while Hajjaj proclaimed obedience to the Caliph who now ruled from Damascus. Days passed. The body hung like a flagpole without a cloth, except that everyone who passed knew this wasn't defeat. This was martyrdom. And then came the moment that would rebuke centuries. Asma bint Abi Bakr, his mother, now more than 100 years old, blind but unfaltering, requested to be led to her son. The people hesitated. How could she look at this? Her son, humiliated like this, hung on the road to warn others. She didn't flinch. With a cane in one hand and reliance on Allah in the other, she stood beneath her son's suspended body. She didn't scream. She didn't despair. She simply said, "You have ruined him in this world, and he has ruined your hereafter." The statement silenced even Hajjaj's hardened criminals. She didn't ask for his release. She asked for patience. And when Hajjaj audaciously requested her to speak well of the Caliph, she turned her weathered, fearless eyes toward him and replied, "Why should I praise someone who sent you to spill blood and burn sanctuaries?" Eventually, Hajjaj, perhaps fearing backlash from scholars or simply tiring of the spectacle, allowed Abdullah's body to be brought down and buried, but by then, his memory had already buried itself in the heart of the Ummah. Stories of his courage spread, quietly at first, whispered in the streets of Medina, the alleys of Basra, the mosques of Damascus, where even those who served the empire lowered their gaze at his name. Time passed and power shifted, but love for him only grew. He became a symbol not of rebellion, but of fearless submission to truth. Historians would write of him not as a king, but as a lantern in an age going dim. His legacy wouldn't be palaces or victory banners, but the scent of sincerity that still lingers in the prayers of those who chose righteousness over reward. No tyrant could recreate that. No caliph, no general, no dynasty could manufacture a man like Abdullah ibn Zubair. His final moments weren't just martyrdom. They were proof that the soul of leadership lies not in how long you rule, but in how fearlessly you stand until you fall. And so ends the life of a man who ruled with nothing but values and died with nothing but victory. He didn't win the Caliphate. He didn't reclaim empires, but he protected one thing more sacred than all of it: his oath to Allah never to obey a tyrant. And when the world offered him safety in exchange for silence, he chose to go quietly into the arms of death with blood-soaked feet and unwavering eyes. No monument marks his grave. No grand inscription tells his story. And yet, his life is engraved deeper than stone, etched into the spiritual legacy of anyone who still believes courage is greater than conquest. Abdullah ibn Zubair, R.A., the rightful rebel, the martyred governor of Hijaz, the son of the sword, the final echo of the golden generation, left not with a roar, but with the sound of one man holding the line when the entire Ummah looked away. In the great halls of history, where rulers carve their names with stone and empire, where kings sit under domes of gold and dynasties echo with power across maps and generations, Abdullah ibn Zubair stands in a different place entirely. He does not stand on a throne. He does not occupy the center of political chronology. His banner does not fly over lost monarchies, and yet, hundreds of years after his death, his name still burns, but gently, like an eternal candle flickering in the corners of every heart that still remembers what honor looks like when untouched by victory. When history speaks of caliphs, it counts what they conquered. When it speaks of generals, it counts what they commanded. But when it speaks of Abdullah ibn Zubair, it lowers its tone, because this man ruled not through force, but through fearlessness, not by winning land, but by refusing to sell his soul. He ruled Mecca not as a king, not as a political tactician, not sheltered by silks or surrounded by servants. He ruled barefoot on sacred ground, between sujud and siege, between fasting and fire. He never changed his clothes to impress, never lengthened his sword to intimidate, never sat above a man who feared Allah more than him. Everything about his life whispered the same message. Leadership isn't about control. It's about embodying every principle you expect your people to die for. And if that means dying yourself, you die with your head high and your tongue firm. In Dhikr, he lived among the last generation to touch the Prophet, but unlike many companions who took witness and then withdrew into quiet scholarship, Abdullah carried that memory into war, into responsibility, into a fight not for glory, but for meaning. In him lived the echo of a golden age, the silent dignity of Abu Bakr, the discipline of Zubair, the courage of Umar, the simplicity of Uthman, and the conscience of Ali. He wasn't just raised in the Prophet's shadow, he was raised in his footsteps. And yet, the weight of his story is not just that he resisted, it's that he resisted alone. One by one, his allies faltered. His commanders chose self-preservation. The scholars' voices grew quieter. The tribes that swore loyalty to his name returned to their old equations of politics. His fall was not a tragic twist. It was a clear path he walked with open eyes. When others chose life with compromise, he chose death without it. And for that, some whisper. Was it worth it? Could he not have lived longer? Could he not have worked from within the system, changed what he could, survived until better winds blew? To those questions, history offers no easy answer, because Abdullah didn't live for results, he lived for truth. And sometimes, a man chooses to fail in the world, so he can walk tall in the hereafter. The Quran doesn't promise that those who stand for justice will always succeed in this life. It promises that they'll be remembered, and perhaps that's the greater victory after all. The scholars remembered him not as a rebel, but as a man of God. Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad, Ibn Taymiyyah, all mentioned him with deference. The jurists praised his adherence to justice under siege. The poets recited his standoff as if it were a sacred legend passed from tongue to tongue. Even the generals who served the Umayyads admitted it. There was something prophetic about Abdullah, something terrifyingly pure. One could cut off his food, his soldiers, his support, even his limbs, but never his spine. And perhaps that's why he had to die. Because men like him remind entire regimes that no matter how high a throne goes, the true caliphate lies in a heart surrendered only to Allah. Abdullah never handed down a kingdom. He left no children to rise to military prominence, no loyal vanguard to rewrite history in his favor. All he left behind was a body that bore the bruises of principle, a heart that didn't bend, and a mother who buried him not with tears, but with respect. He died crucified, not defeated, executed, but not erased. Hajjaj and Abdul Malik lived longer, ruled longer, buried their enemies in deeper graves. But they died rulers over territory. Abdullah died as ruler over his own nafs. And on the day of judgment, that may carry more weight than any empire. To stand alone is the hardest thing a man can do. Even harder is when that stand is made in front of the world's greatest symbol of unity, the Kaaba. And still, the world turns away. That's the defining moment of Abdullah's legacy. Not that he was betrayed. Not that he was abandoned by armies, but that he stood anyway. Because he did not pray toward gold, nor sleep beside kings. He did not study religion to build prestige. He studied it until it flowed through his marrow. So, when death came, he didn't pray for escape. He prayed for acceptance. So few men do that with sincerity. In the end, Abdullah ibn Zubair reminds us of one thing, that the true test of leadership is not found in conquest, but in what you're willing to suffer for the truth. He didn't leave behind palaces. He didn't compile books or dictate law. But he lived a life so loud in courage that history has been whispering about it ever since, ashamed to forget. He fell alone, yes, but he fell facing the Qibla, sword in one hand, surrender on his lips, not to creation, but to the Creator. He was a martyr without a throne, but he sat in history like a king sits in prostration, unmoved, unbought, and unforgettable.